Welcome to the Hennepin-University Partnership Winter Webinar Series. My name is Sarah Sandgren, and I'm a graduate assistant with the Hennepin-University Partnership, here with our county colleague, Scott Vargo, as well. Thanks for joining us virtually today. A few Zoom reminders for our audience. Your video and chat and audio are not enabled, but please use the chat box that you'll find along the bottom of the Zoom window if you need any sort of technical support. And if you'd like to ask a question for our presenter, you can submit that through the chat box or through the Q&A in your Zoom window. And we'll save questions for the end, and our presenter will take questions at the end of our time together. Please also look for an email from hup@umn.edu on Monday with some follow-up information, a survey, and a link to the recorded video of this presentation. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce our presenter for today. Dr. Adam Bledsoe is Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. Professor Bledsoe is interested in a variety of questions pertaining to the African diaspora and how people of African descent in the Americas understand, critique, and offer alternatives to societal structures that oppress them. He sees Blackness as a global phenomenon that manifests in different ways across different times and spaces. These variations aside, he also sees Blackness as a phenomenon that has led to important theorizations and practices of liberation around the world. This past summer, Professor Bledsoe created and published online a syllabus intended to offer an introduction to how Minneapolis became a flashpoint for a global uprising against anti-Blackness and state violence. We are so glad to welcome him here today to share more about his research and work. With that, I'll turn it over to our presenter. Welcome, Dr. Bledsoe.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who's here today. I've been asked to kind of start out talking a little bit about geography kind of broadly as a discipline, and why a geographer would be interested in something like the Twin Cities Uprising. So I think oftentimes people think about geography, they think of maps, right? They think of mapping things and sort of cartographically representing them. But geography is actually an incredibly broad discipline. You know, in our department, we have people that study everything from climate change to Latinx, migrant civil society, to, you know, just about anything you can think of. And really what geographers are interested in is how we come to understand and know places in certain ways, right? So what I'm interested in, and part of the reason why I'm taking on this topic of the Twin Cities Uprising, is that I want us to think about the ways in which relationships between people, power relationships between people and public and private institutions, how those make place as we understand them, right? Why do we understand the Twin Cities as we do? Why do we experience the Twin Cities as we do? And how might we be experiencing the Twin Cities in different ways, depending on things like race, gender, class, etc. So, you know, starting out, as Sarah mentioned, I put together the Minneapolis Uprising syllabus shortly after the police murder of George Floyd, and shortly after the 2020 uprising began. And when I'm going to be referencing the uprising at different points throughout this talk. And when I talk about that, when I say uprising, what I'm really talking about is the kind of combination of the weeks-long organic street-level protests and occupations of public space that took place across the Twin Cities in 2020, as well as the calls for fundamental change in society, calls for things like police abolition, calls for sort of rethinking and trying to reform how public institutions work for the people of the Twin Cities. So that's what I'm going to be referencing and referring to when I talk about the 2020 uprising. Now, the way that the media kind of covered the 2020 uprising is that there was a lot of emphasis put on, and understandably so, put on police and community relations, right? Specifically police relations with the Twin Cities Black community. So we heard a lot about previous police murders of people like Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Thurman Blevins, and Justine Damon. And while, you know, I believe and I think most people would acknowledge that those were incredibly significant moments in the buildup to the 2020 uprising, right? That wasn't, it is not the whole story. Those events in and of themselves can't tell the whole story of how and why the 2020 uprising occurred. And so here I'm going to turn to the words of Elder Mahmoud Al-Khati, who is a community elder in the Twin Cities and a very, very important and longstanding intellectual leader of the Black community. And Elder Mahmoud basically says, you know, if you don't understand the background to a story, you can't ever really understand the story, right? If we don't understand the background to what has happened leading up to 2020, you know, we can't really know why we saw what we saw, why we experienced what we experienced then. And so what I saw the Minneapolis Uprising syllabus as was a tool, a very, very small, right, first step towards getting that backstory, right, getting the story behind the story of the 2020 uprising. And so what I'm going to do today in this talk is discuss a little bit about what the Minneapolis Uprising syllabus can teach us and show us. Okay, so everything I'm going to present today can be found in the Minneapolis Uprising syllabus. If you haven't checked it out and you find any part of the story that I'm going to tell today compelling, you should check the syllabus out. But just to give you a sense of what it is I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start out discussing a little bit about kind of historical anti-Blackness and Black resistance in Minnesota broadly. And when I say historical, I mean, you know, late 19th century, mid 19th century into the very, very early first couple decades of the 20th century. I'm going to touch on that very briefly. That is not going to be the main focus of the talk. What I'm trying to do is kind of set up an understanding of how anti-Blackness and Black resistance has existed in Minnesota essentially since Minnesota became a state. I'm then going to offer just a single slide on the common characteristics that I see of Black struggle in the Twin Cities as it has occurred over the past century. Okay, so starting in the early 20th century and going to the present. And then I'm going to kind of break down what I see as some, not all, major forms of Black struggle from around the 1920s through the present day. Now, I should say, you know, as kind of a disclaimer that I don't pretend to present every single aspect of Black struggle or the Black experience in this talk. That's not possible. And the Uprising syllabus doesn't really do that either. I think it offers, as I said, a good first step, but there is still more work to be done on this topic. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and I think this is really important, it's something that is that we have to grapple with and confront, is that Minnesota has been an anti-Black place for a very long time. It has been shot through with anti-Black relations since even before it became a state, when it was still a territory, right? And I don't say that to pick on Minnesota or to make Minnesota seem like it's a far worse place than anywhere else. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that Minnesota is part of the United States. It's part of a wider society that has been rooted in anti-Blackness, right, since its founding. And so just to give you a couple examples kind of what this has looked like in the territorial era, in St. Paul specifically, Black settlement was discouraged by settlers living in St. Paul. Right, in the 1950s, there were formal segregation laws passed that segregated specifically Black students from schools in St. Paul as well. Okay, so even before it was an official state in the Union, Minnesotans, or people who were living in the Minnesota Territory, were concerned with kind of separating themselves from Black people. Okay. Following statehood, there continued to be different forms and different sort of complicities with anti-Blackness that took place in Minnesota. So Minnesota was a regular tourist destination for Southern slaveholders, especially in the summertime. And, you know, Minnesota businesses and hotels, resorts, things like that catered to people who made their living off of the enslaved labor of others. In 1860, Eliza Winston, who was an enslaved woman visiting St. Anthony from Mississippi, was freed by a number, with the help of a number of people in Minnesota. And when everything went to court and she was eventually proclaimed free by a district judge, riots occurred in St. Anthony in response to this. In 1870, St. Paul, Black people who made up less than 1% of the population made up over 10% of those incarcerated for crimes like theft, right? So even in the 1870s, less than 1% of the population, Black people were disproportionately policed and incarcerated. And there was an anti-miscegenation bill in the 1920s that was introduced at the state legislature that ultimately didn't pass, and yet still kind of demonstrates, can demonstrate to us the presence of anti-Black sentiment. Now, at the same time that Minnesota has always been a site of anti-Blackness, there's also always been a site of Black resistance. And again, I'm just going to touch on this really briefly, but the St. Paul was a site of the Underground Railroad, which is something that I think is not very well publicized, but makes a very interesting part of early St. Paul history. So in the 1850s, William Taylor of St. Paul, Black man of St. Paul, along with his nephew, Joseph Farr, who is pictured here, ran a stretch of the Underground Railroad through St. Paul. I mentioned before the case of Eliza Winston, who escaped slavery while in Minnesota. She was helped by Emily Goodrich Gray, who was a Black woman who resided with her family in St. Anthony in the late 19th century. And I see these people really as kind of the forerunners of the people who we see struggling today, right? The people who are calling for things like police abolition, people who are working to educate Black youth in an Afrocentric way. Our four runners are people like this: Joseph Farr, William Taylor, Emily Goodrich Gray. And so all of this is to kind of show that the struggles of Black people in the face of anti-Blackness is something that has persisted, even as the Black population of Minnesota was incredibly small prior to the early 20th century. Now I'm going to move away from this and begin to talk about the past century, past 100 or so years of Black struggle in the Twin Cities. And what I'm going to talk about throughout these different sort of moments in history is that I see four sort of common characteristics of Black struggle in the Twin Cities. The first is that there is a routine use of public protests and occupations of public space, coupled with grassroots organizing to affect change. So that's a common thing that we're going to see throughout the past 100 years. The second factor is the recognition that there are numerous issues and forms of oppression that Black people struggle against. So we'll see again, it's never just a single issue of housing. It's never just a single issue of education, employment, police violence. It's all of these things at the same time in a lot of ways. The third is the centrality in the importance of women leadership in these different moments, right? And the fourth is the reality of cross-racial engagement and the cultivation of cross-racial alliances in these various forms of struggle. Now, I'm not going to explicitly stop and say, name each one of these things in each case that I talk about, but hopefully it becomes clear to you all, it becomes clear that each case that I'm going to talk about has these four characteristics. Now, in order to understand the characteristics, right, and the experience of the early 20th century Black struggle in the Twin Cities, it's important to understand kind of the history of the demographic shift of the United States that took place in the early 20th century via the Great Migration. Okay, so around America's involvement in World War I and going through the period of the Second World War, Black people moved out of the South in incredibly large numbers. to escape the violence of Jim Crow and to work jobs that were becoming available as part of the wartime economy. Now, typically when people think of the Great Migration, we think of places like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, right, Oakland. Minnesota doesn't always figure into these larger narratives of the Great Migration, and there's a reason for that. It's because Minnesota had a relatively small number of Black migrants arrive compared to other places like Detroit, Cleveland, Oakland, et cetera. And this goes back to the original point that I talked about, was the long-running anti-Blackness of Minnesota. Part of the reason why there were so few Black migrants that arrived in the Twin Cities was because white employers in the Twin Cities refused to hire Black workers except in some service industries. And we'll talk about what those industries were in a second. On the other hand, you also had efforts by public entities like the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce to work in concert with the Urban League in places like St. Paul to actively limit the number of Black migrants that arrived from the US South in the Twin Cities. So that led to a smaller increase in Minnesota's Black population when compared to other parts of the Rust Belt, the northeastern United States and the West Coast. And yet, nonetheless, there was an increase, a fairly significant increase in Black arrivals to the Twin Cities. Now, when they got here, they were sort of forced into a limited number of jobs, right? And very sort of famously, those jobs were either on the railroad. Black men frequently worked as porters on the railroad. And they also worked, Black men and women worked in the hotel and restaurant industry. So Black men worked as waiters in restaurants. Black women could work as maids, receptionists, elevator operators, and things of that nature. And yet these jobs, while they were available to Black people, were very discriminatory in kind of their treatment and in the remuneration that Black people received in these jobs. So Black workers received lower wages than white workers did for doing the same jobs. They were not allowed to unionize. In the case of the porters, for instance, were not included in the railroad unions, which were gaining power and prestige at that time. And in all of these jobs, Black people were sort of expected to defer to and act in a subservient manner to the white clients, right, and sort of white bosses in these jobs. And so, unsurprisingly, it is the sphere of labor that Black people began to organize in earnest in the early 19th century. So on the railroads, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, which officially became affiliated with the AFL in 1934, was a very significant site of struggle for Black workers. Local 614, which was an all-Black local in Minneapolis, was a hotel and workers union. It was chartered by the AFL in the American Federation of Labor in 1930. And then the miscellaneous workers, local 665, which was the first integrated union in Minnesota, was chartered in 1935. So the ability of these organizations to unionize was a really big step and a really big moment in the Black struggle, right? Early struggle for civil rights in Minnesota. So what did this get them, right? What did this lead to? Well, it led to a number of things. And gains were able to be made in this case as Black labor activists threatened to use mass actions like strikes, marches, and protests. So in 1938, right, the Black hotel workers of Local 614, Black hotel and restaurant workers of Local 614, threatened to strike if their pay is not made equal to that of white people who work the same jobs, right? And after almost 2 years of struggling, they eventually gain equal pay and back wages as well. The Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters becomes unionized in 1934, and eventually, excuse me, and eventually, give me one second. And eventually managed to secure higher salaries, reduced working hours, and the ability to file grievances against their employers. On top of all of this, right, rise in wages, improved working conditions. At the same time that all of those things were happening, legislative gains were also being made. So people who were active in organizing Local 665 and Local 614, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, were also working to push Minnesota politicians to enact legislation that would be progressive on issues of labor. So in 1947, Minneapolis becomes the first city in the country to pass anti-discrimination labor legislation. And that was thanks in part to the efforts of Black labor activists who pushed people like Hubert Humphrey, who was mayor of Minneapolis at the time, to pass this kind of legislation. Now, very important to this, to these labor struggles were Black women. Now, people like Nellie Stone Johnson, who you see pictured here on the right, very much make up kind of the mainstream dominant narrative of labor struggle in the early 20th century. She was active with Local 665 and was one of the people who really pushed that 1947 anti-discrimination legislation as well. And yet there are also people, Black women, who have not received their due in a lot of ways for the efforts that they put into the Black labor struggle. So women like Della Roberts, Carrie McWatt, Allie Mae Hampton, who were part of the Colored Women's Pioneer Economic Club, groups like the one you see pictured here on the left, were incredibly important to the efforts of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 1920s and 1930s. So these women did all kinds of things for the Brotherhood. They fundraised for the organization. You know, they held bid whist tournaments and luncheons and things like that to raise money for the organization. They provided space at their houses for union meetings. They established funds for Brotherhood members and their families who were in need. And something that I think is also cannot be sort of overstated is the effort that they put in to canvass Black neighborhoods and make Black families aware of the importance of unionizing, right, to combat anti-union sentiment. So in a lot of ways, the successes of organizations like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the general labor struggle, Black labor struggle of the early 20th century was made possible by the efforts of Black women. Also important, and something that cannot, I think, be overstated, is the alliances that were cultivated between organizations like Local 614, the hotel and restaurant workers, and non-white, traditionally non-Black unions like the Teamsters. So I talked a little bit about the threat of strike by Local 614 in 1938, and part of the reason why eventually that threat of strike yielded results, right, in higher pay and payment of back wages, was because the Teamsters Union, which was incredibly powerful at the time, incredibly prominent, threatened to strike as well, right? Threatened to join the strike that 614 had put before their employer, the Curtis Hotel, if the demands were not met, right? And this was something that had been cultivated over a long period of time. Members of Local 614 had actually worked with and helped the Teamsters strike of 1934. So these alliances were really vital and really important to realizing the successes of the Black labor struggle of the early 20th century. Now, as I mentioned, out of this came progressive legislation. And in addition to the 1947 anti-discrimination law in Minneapolis, later legislation was also passed at the state level. So in 1955, a fair employment law was passed statewide. And in 1960, a fair housing bill was passed statewide as well. And that fair housing bill was the first of its kind in the country. So a lot of the times when we talk about Minnesota being a progressive place, it's the history of those things, right? This progressive legislation getting passed that sort of informs that idea of Minnesota progressivism. You know, people like Hubert Humphrey, who was mayor of Minneapolis when the anti-discrimination law was passed, and Orville Freeman, who was governor of the state when the Fair Housing Bill and statewide Fair Employment Act was passed, they were both DFL politicians in the DFL. They're kind of put forward as being sort of examples of that progressivism, right? And it's important to point out that as progressive as their actions and legislation, as progressive as those things were, it was in large part, and oftentimes because there were Black men and women pushing them to enact these things. At the same time that this progressive legislation is being passed, however, anti-Blackness is persisting, and now we're getting into kind of the mid to late 20th century moment. So in the 1950s and 1960s, Black Twin Cities communities continued to face job discrimination. Displacement from various infrastructure projects was also quite prominent at the time. So many of you have probably heard of the construction of I-94 and kind of how it really displaced and really hampered kind of the growth of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, which was a historically Black neighborhood. I-35 did the same thing in South Minneapolis to historically Black neighborhood there as well. City services like transportation, childcare, and medical services were lacking in Black communities. Overcrowded housing, lack of recreational facilities, segregated schools, disproportionately high rates of poverty, and police violence all typified the Black experience in the middle to late 20th century. And what these conditions contributed to was an increasing frustration, which ultimately led to a number of uprisings and rebellions in the 1960s. In that regard, Minnesota wasn't unlike much of the country. The 1960s was a time of urban rebellion, on the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest. These things were happening quite frequently. And so in 1966, there was an uprising in North Minneapolis after a white shop owner opened fire on 11 Black youths. In 1967, there was perhaps the biggest and most famous uprising prior to 2020, following police assault of a Black woman after the Aquatennial Parade. In 1968, there was an uprising in St. Paul following the St. Paul police tear gassing a Black party that was held at a hall. And in 1969, there was another uprising against the issue of police brutality. Now, these uprisings were not nearly as large scale or as widespread, nor as sustained as what happened this past year. However, they did these uprisings did lead to property damage and injuries to police and civilians in some cases. And more importantly, these uprisings sort of forced people not in the Black community to reckon with the fact and take note of the fact of what was going on in these communities, right? And so following especially the 66 and 67 uprising, there was a push on the part of Black communities to not only get that recognition, but to also get assistance from public and private donors and actors to fund community-based programs that the people in these communities would run themselves. So two of the organizations that arose at this time were the Way and the City Incorporated. The Way was located on the near north side and offered a number of services to the north side community: spaces for children to study, spaces of recreation, childcare, spaces to practice arts, help in searching for jobs, voter registration, legal services, and food and clothing donations. Also importantly, and I also think is kind of a precursor to what we're seeing today, there was patrols that were put together by the Way in association with the Way that worked to kind of mediate conflicts within the community in a way that the police would not need to be called. So unarmed organizations like the Soul Force were started and associated with the Way. And at the same time, there was also an organization called the Black Patrol, which also worked in the north side, that dealt with situations that had the threat of getting violent, right? And the idea was to kind of prevent police from having to intervene in those scenarios. The City Incorporated, on the other hand, was located in South Minneapolis, specifically in the Phillips and Powderhorn neighborhoods. They offered social spaces for local youth, school programs, and family therapy programs in the 1960s and 1970s. And again, as I mentioned, the one of the common characteristics here that Black women figured very prominently in both of these organizations. So in the WAVE, for instance, women like Gwen Jones Davis was a co-founder and a program director, and Verlena Marikiki, who is pictured here on the right, ran the education program for the same organization, for the WAVE. And while the WAVE and the city both worked with and for Black communities, they also had ties to non-Black actors, right? So both organizations received funding, the majority of their funding, from different corporations and white philanthropic organizations. The WAVE held classes not just for Black youth and Black adults, but also non-Black people. They actually held classes in the suburbs where they reached out to white youth and adults, and in their classes sort of discussed the pathology of racism. The WAVE also coordinated with the American Indian Movement, the Minneapolis branch of the American Indian Movement, to create a law firm to provide free legal services to the people of color of Minneapolis. So we can see, again, kind of the expansive nature of this struggle, right? The inclusion of not just Black people, but non-Black people as well. And these struggles had sort of wider reverberations than just in these specific neighborhoods. So the education classes at the WAVE, for instance, had a profound effect on Black University of Minnesota students. And it was what they learned in spaces like the WAVE and other community organizations in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Black-run community organizations in St. Paul and Minneapolis, that a small group of Black students at the University of Minnesota got the idea to push for programming specifically for urban Black students at the university. Right? And so what ends up happening is as the students sort of organize and make their demands on the university, they begin to feel like the university is not taking them seriously, not acting fast enough. And this leads to the 1969 occupation of Morrill Hall at the University of Minnesota. It was led by a number of students, some of whom are pictured here on the left: Rose Freeman, Warren Tucker, Horace Huntley, and one that is not pictured is Marie Braddock Williams. So again, Black women played a central role in this moment. And what the occupation of Morrill Hall ended up getting, what it ended up resulting in, was the founding of the African American and African Studies Department, as well as programs like the MLK Scholars Program, which is still in place at the University of Minnesota. So, that kind of brings to a close, or nearly brings to a close, the conversation about the early to mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century struggles. And so what we see is that from the 1920s through the 1970s, Black struggle in the Twin Cities was born of militant actions, such as labor strikes, urban uprisings, and the occupation of public space, in the hopes of directly addressing the entrenched forms of anti-Blackness present in the cities. These mass actions yielded concessions from the Twin Cities power establishment, leading to increased wages for some sectors of the workforce, progressive legislation, the funding of community-run and community-based organizations, and academic changes to the state's flagship university. As I've tried to show, these forms of struggle were also defined by their localized grassroots qualities, the centrality of women to the realization of these goals, and the direct engagement with and education of non-Black communities in the Twin Cities. Now, as we move into the late 20th and the early 21st century, we see the ability and the willingness of Black communities to continue to try to address the shifting issues and shifting problems of anti-Blackness that they are faced with. So the city, right, that I talked about a little bit earlier, continued its educational and therapy programs while also expanding in the 1990s and creating programs like the Adolescent Pregnancy and Parenting Program, the At-Risk Youth Service Program, and the United for Peace Program, which brokered a coalition between four of Minneapolis's most kind of prominent urban gangs, right? And at the same time that they did all of this, they also sought to create employment opportunities for Black and Indigenous and youth of color, and gave Black youth space in which they could kind of grapple with, name, and discuss the police violence that they face on a regular basis, as in the case of the Minneapolis police murder of Tysel Nelson in 1990, which is kind of represented here on the left. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, the issue of the education, right, of Black students was taken up by the African American Academy for Accelerated Learning, which was started by Elder Katie Sample. The AAAL, as it was known and as it is known, addressed the issue of the undereducation of Black youth in the Twin Cities and offered weekend and summer educational programs where Black youth could learn in a non-punitive and culturally aware environment. At the end of the 90s, in 1996, the Cultural Wellness Center was started by Atom Azahir, Elder Atom Azahir, as a healing and wellness space for the Black community. And what I see these organizations as doing, and again, these aren't the only organizations that were active at the time, but what these organizations were doing was identifying the prevailing forms of anti-Blackness that Black people and Black communities were facing, and try to create a space in which Black youth, Black adults, Black people generally could engage in a way that was not so sort of determined by those forms of anti-Blackness. Now, when we talk about what's going on today, right, we can see the 2020 uprising as using the occupation of public spaces, disrupting the status quo in order to draw attention to the realities of anti-Blackness in the Twin Cities. Again, in 2020, right, just as in the 1960s, just as in the 1930s, only through literally forcing the Twin Cities broadly to acknowledge the problems facing Black Minnesotans has the current potential for change and the current calls for change been brought into being. While police violence has acted as the igniter, right, the murder of George Floyd was the igniter of the 2020 uprising, actions of grassroots organizations have demonstrated that there are various problems in need of change in the Twin Cities. So following the uprisings, right, various news sources were kind of drawing on the realities, we're trying to draw on the realities of life in the Twin Cities, turning to different organizations and the work that they've done to point out that there is a tremendous amount of racialized inequality present in the Twin Cities. All of its progressivism aside, right? All of its nominal progressivism aside, income, home ownership, poverty levels, unemployment, incarceration, and education are all areas in which there are incredibly racialized divisions. And it is through, as I said, the current activity of grassroots, largely women-led organizations that we see the necessity of addressing these issues. So I'm going to go through just a couple of the organizations currently active that are trying to kind of address these problems. We have organizations like the Northside Emergency Resource Pop-Up that evidences the realities of food insecurity in North Minneapolis. And this is something that can be seen through the various mutual aid autonomous zones that popped up during the uprising, where the grassroots nature of these organizations, the fact that it was people on the ground living in these communities that were putting together packages of food, diapers, things like that for the people of these communities, that we see the fragility of these systems, right? That the access to necessary goods and services are not there for people of color and for especially the Black communities in the Twin Cities. Various neighborhood patrols in both North and South Minneapolis. One of the examples is the Minnesota Freedom Fighters. Reflect the realities and the openness to violence that Black communities in the Twin Cities face. The necessity of coming up with those patrols was born of the fact that these were neighborhoods that were targeted by white supremacist and outside agitator actors during the uprising. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, the work of organizations like MPD 150, Reclaim the Block, and Black Visions are working to create a city absent of prevailing police relations. Right? These organizations have been born of, have drawn on, and have channeled the communal frustration with continued violence of police forces against Black communities and other communities of color in the Twin Cities. And I see all of these organizations that just mentioned as kind of giving insight, right, acting on the front lines of addressing the many issues that Black communities in the Twin Cities face. Furthermore, all of these organizations, or most of these organizations, have had Black women sort of at the center of them. So the North Side Emergency Resource pop-up was started by Black women in North Minneapolis. Black Visions Collective is an avowedly queer Black feminist organization run by queer Black women. And so again, we see examples of Black women taking leadership roles and really being the ones at the forefront of pushing these struggles. And throughout all of this, undeniably, non-Black allies have played very prominent roles, whether we talk about the protests that took place following George Floyd's murder, or we talk about the actual personnel in organizations like Reclaim the Block and MPD 150. Non-Black people have played incredibly important roles in the 2020 uprising and in naming these realities of anti-Blackness and addressing them. So I'm going to close here with a couple of quotes, right, that I see as kind of being perhaps temporally separate from one another, but at the same time, both evidencing kind of a desire and the necessity of bringing intergenerational struggle together. So on the one hand, we have Oluchi Omeoga, a co-founder of Black Visions, who says that in order to have liberation, right, in order to have Black liberation, we need to have a multi-generational approach, recognition of the necessity of different generations in the Black community and in the Twin Cities generally kind of coming together. This quote was preceded by a statement saying that it is young Black queer people who are doing the majority of this work right now. And on the other hand, we have Josie Johnson, right, another community elder who has been working for Black civil rights for the past 70 years almost, has been active since the 1950s. And what she has said recently is that the spirit and strength of those people protesting, the people out in the streets protesting, keeps those of the veteran activist generation fighting and being hopeful. So here, I think we get that idea of needing the story, right, behind the story, needing that knowledge, that wisdom, those experiences of past struggles to merge together with those that are currently in the struggle. And so, that's what I see the Minneapolis Uprising syllabus as kind of being a very, very preliminary, very small first step towards, is bridging that generational divide, showing kind of the breadth and the richness of that struggle, right? That we as Black Minnesotans have been fighting for certainly the past 100 years, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we talked even before that. And so I'll end there, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you all have.
Thanks so much, Professor Bledsoe. To our audience, if you'd like to submit questions either in the chat or via the Q&A, we'll gladly take some of those. And I also wanted to announce we can share a link to the syllabus in the email that I'll send out to all of our attendees next week. So that can be made available to all of our attendees online. Don't see any questions yet. One question that I had to get us started as people are submitting questions is maybe about connections to like a national movement, or what are the relationships between larger issues beyond our own community, and how do you see that playing out and maybe coming up more in the future, or
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. And, you know, it's something that I didn't put in the talk because you only have so much time, but I think another way that you could take this particular talk and this particular issue, right, is to say that not only is there this constancy of Black struggle in the Twin Cities, but that in a lot of ways, that struggle is informed by, and I shouldn't say is informed by, it's part of wider national Black struggles, right? So when we talk about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in St. Paul, right? Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was organizing all over the country, right? A. Philip Randolph was active all over the country in trying to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. In the 1960s, 1970s, as the Way, right, Soul Force, the City, all these organizations are coming into being. They are, you know, the Black Panthers are organizing. You know, this is following the civil rights movement. So, you know, all of these things are occurring kind of at the same time that all these other forms of similar approaches are happening in and around different parts of the United States. I think right now, you know, if you look at what's going on in what's been going on, right, what happened in the 2020 uprising, that was very much informed by, right, the prior work done by Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives, which has its own active chapter here in Minnesota. You know, and again, I'm not trying to say that these organizations are exact carbon copies of what's going on elsewhere, but Minnesota, despite its relatively speaking small Black population, is very plugged into you know, the national feelings, national sentiments, national trends with organizing. So, you know, I don't see it as something that is just specific to the Twin Cities. I think it's something that makes us part of a larger kind of collective.
Thank you. We have one question from an attendee who says, where can we continue to learn more about this? Do you recommend books, community classes, videos, anything like that?
Yeah, so, you know, that's kind of one of the things with the syllabus. I think the syllabus is a good start. And I'm not just saying that because I came up with it, you know, but I was very intentional with trying to put multimedia sources on there, right? So what we find out is that while there's maybe not a central kind of narrative bringing all of these things together that we can find in one place, there's a ton of podcasts, documentaries, books, articles. One place, I don't know how much time the person who asked the question has on their hands, but Black Twin Cities newspapers are an incredibly rich, long-term source that you can go. The Spokesman Recorder, St. Paul Appeal, Insight News, all of these things are in a lot of ways kind of the voice of the Black Twin Cities. So, you know, I think there are a number of books. There's a number of academic articles, there's news articles, there's blogs, you know, there's a lot of things that, where we can go to learn this. I, you know, hope that eventually what comes of this, and hope to play a part in this eventually, is the creation of some kind of communal based, you know, open access classes and like workshops that we can put together to talk about these things. So yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of good sources, and there still needs to be more that needs to be done, I think, to kind of bring these different stories together.
Great, thanks. And I'll remind the audience, if you look for an email from hup@umn.edu early next week, I'll include links to the syllabus where you can find all of these resources. And we'll also include a link to the presentation. We're recording the video today, and we can share that link as well, somebody asked. Another question, could you comment on how Black from Africa or Afro-Latino and non-Black immigration to the Twin Cities has furthered or complicated local Black resistance?
Absolutely, and that was part of, I didn't get into that in my talk today, but that is also part of the Uprising syllabus, is the fact that, right, in the 90s, especially, immigration from East Africa, and in particular Somalia, very much sort of broadened, and yeah, it broadened the Black community in the Twin Cities. I think that, again, when in hearing accounts, in being, you know, in South Minneapolis, in the Powder Horn area during the 2020 uprising, I would say that the the role of immigrant populations, in particular African immigrant populations, was very important to the process of protest, the process of cleanup right after the uprising occurred, the process of really grappling kind of with what happened. So, you know, I do think that plays a part. I admittedly, and this is bad as somebody who's a scholar of the African diaspora, I'm not well aware of the Afro-Latinx kind of organized history in the Twin Cities, as far as like organizations and things like that. So, you know, that's a shameful blind spot on my part. I'm not sure how to comment on that.
Thanks. Another question, an audience member shared, I'm interested in the role of art in this past summer's movement, as well as the description of 38th in Chicago as a sacred space. Any comments on these things?
Yeah, so there is a really great project that is being put together by the University of St. Thomas, in particular, Dr. Todd Lawrence, and I'm forgetting what department Dr. Lawrence is in. But he actually, in a number of students and colleagues of his at St. Thomas, they've put together an archive, a base of kind of all the different forms of public art that have come up. And I mean, you know, and this goes back to the geography thing, right, that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. In a lot of ways, we make space what it is, right? We give definition to space. So calling 38th in Chicago a sacred space, right? Making it a sacred space, not just calling it that, but the actions that we have to take to make it that way. Creating George Floyd Square, right? Blocking it off from traffic, having it be a site where people can come and really try to sit with what happened there and what that means for us now, what past events have led to that, and what it can mean for the future. You know, those are profoundly spatial and spatializing placemaking practices. So I think art has been a big part of that. I mean, you know, there's all kinds of murals, all kinds of, you know, artwork in the streets being painted with names of you know, previously departed, you know, ancestors now at this point. So I think that is incredibly important. And I would encourage you to check out. There was a really good article written about Dr. Lawrence at University of St. Thomas and the archive that they're putting together. And I can't remember what venue it was in now, but you should check that out if that's something that you're interested in.
Thank you. We'll try to find a link for that and share that next week too. Another person mentioned the URAC, the University of Minnesota Center in North Minneapolis, and wondering if there would be classes for high school students about activism and history, or if you know anything about that.
You know, I don't know. That's a really good question, and that should be something that is being done. I know that the African American Academy for Accelerated Learning, AAAL, is in the process of trying to get sort of going again. And one of the things that they've talked about is trying to start classes for you know, adolescent and teenage youth to work on these topics. But yeah, you know, I always feel a little bit bad because I feel like teaching at the college level, it's almost too late to be learning all this stuff, right? This needs to be the education, this kind of education needs to be being done from the time kids begin to start to read and write and learn social studies and all this stuff. I think, you know, this needs to be an important part of that, and very much at the high school level as well. You know, I really do think there is a need for creating a communal-based kind of open venue, open space for people to learn this stuff. You know, learn about where you're from, learn about why, you know, you live where you live, learn about why you experience the spaces the way you do.
Great. And if it's okay with Professor Bledsoe, we can also share contact information next week. If people are interested in reaching out, if that would be okay with you, we
yes, please.
Maybe do that. Great. And so to our attendees, if you have questions that come up later, please look for that resource next week that'll come into your email. Another attendee commented, appreciated learning context for the events today by looking at the key figures and events of the past. Do you, Professor, think there is something specific about Minnesota that sparked the uprising with such intensity and extending globally? In your opinion, does it have to do with our marked disparities?
That's a good question. Why Minnesota? I think that is, that's a question that a lot of people have had, and that's one of the reasons why I started this syllabus, right? Was friends of mine not from Minnesota saying, how is this happening in Minnesota? I didn't even know there were Black people in Minnesota, which is offensive in all kinds of ways. But specific about Minnesota, I think there is something about the history of Black community organizing in Minnesota, in that there are not, numerically speaking, there are not a lot of us, right? And historically, Black people have been segregated into certain neighborhoods, and so I think that there's a fair amount of cohesion, and hopefully this doesn't sound too essentialist or simplifying things, but I do think that there is a certain amount of cohesion among the Black communities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, in that not everybody is on the same page, not everybody thinks the same thing, does the same thing, wants the same thing, or anything like that. But I think that there's a way in which experiences and ideas are communicated that spread a lot faster because of the close-knitted nature of Black community in the Twin Cities. And so I think probably part of the reason why things happened so quickly and spread so fast here was because of that, right? And I also, the other thing I want to do is to make sure that I give props to and recognize the fact that the work of organizations like Reclaim the Black, Black Visions, has been very intentional. And I'm not part of either one of those organizations, and I don't pretend to speak for them, but in the few conversations I've had with the people of those organizations and what I do know about them, I think they've been very, very careful, very intentional with kind of how they've organized. So I think it's that, I think it's a combination kind of where we find ourselves, the nature of how we've related to one another, and the conscious decisions on the part of those who are organized to kind of make this a thing. And then some of this, I think, you never know how an image or how a video or how something is going to affect the rest of the world. So I can't speak, to exactly why, what happened here, why it affected everybody around the world the way it did, but it did. So here we are.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. Thank you to all of our attendees who have submitted questions. One person asked, based on this historical perspective, what is the most impactful action non-Black allies can take?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. I think first and foremost, non-Black people, what they can do if they want to help Black struggle is listen to Black people, right? And listen to Black people that are doing the work. And one of the things, and I didn't get into this in the talk, but one of the things that is, again, a constant kind of recurring theme throughout all of this is that organizations like the Way, organizations like the city, AAAL, right? They do well insofar as they have, let me back up. They financially do well insofar as they have the financial backing of these largely white organizations, right? And once, whatever the reason is, whether it's a downturn in the economy or somebody for the organization says something that doesn't sit well with the white philanthropic organizations, once that support is kind of withdrawn, right, then it becomes difficult for these organizations oftentimes to reproduce themselves. And so I think there's this kind of, and this isn't just in the Twin Cities, this is a common theme, I think, a lot of the time. The respectability politics that go into the fine line that Black organizations and Black people have to walk in order to not only secure but maintain those alliances, I think it's really unfair a lot of the time. I think it's very patronizing, and I think that to be an ally, right, means not only listening to Black people, but recognizing the fact that a Black experience is not a non-Black experience. No matter how oppressed one might think they are, no matter how oppressed one might be, Black experiences are, I think, are unique, and Black experiences are the only things that can inform a Black politics, right, and Black struggle. And so sort of submitting oneself to that, if you are non-Black and you want to be part of the struggle, you have to submit yourself to that, which isn't to say that you go along with anything that any Black person ever says, right? But I think kind of being self-reflexive, thinking about who you are and what your support means. And then, like I said, submitting yourself to taking direction from and being informed by what Black struggle is what you can do. And that can look like a lot of different things, right? It can look like showing up, being present, doing the grunt work of whatever it might be. It can mean being monetarily supportive. It can mean a lot of different things. But I think first and foremost, you have to take direction from the Black organizations and people that are doing the work on the ground.
Wow, thanks so much. And I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. We are running out of time, but wanted to say thanks again so much to Professor Bledsoe for sharing this presentation with us and all of these great resources. And we will be in touch with all of our attendees next week with some follow-up and links for them to share. So thank you all for coming. And with that, we will close for today. Thank you again, Professor.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.